And then the other event that you have going on for Women's History Month is a tour that's happening all month called Spinsters and Suffragists. It explores the prevailing attitudes about gender and gender roles in the Victorian era. Can you talk about some of the key gender roles and norms that were present in the Victorian era? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah. So the interesting thing when this tour was being developed was an earlier iteration of it really looked at how men expected women to act in the Victorian era. And I think that's what most of us sort of think of when we think about this time period and the stereotypes around women and the Victorian period, this idea of women as being having to be chaste and innocent and pure, but also having to be mothers and having to be that nurturing spirit. And this idea, there's a Victorian concept of the angel in the house. It was popularized by a poem written by a man, of course, about how, a woman's job was really to serve her husband and her family, and that she needs to forgive him no matter what he does, and all of those kinds of things. But obviously, people throughout all time have followed their own hearts and their own ways of being. And so even during the Victorian period, there were lots of women and trans individuals and people with diverse gender expressions that were existing and thriving. And so that's really what this tour digs into.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about this. How did the attitudes about gender, how did they, unless you were a man, if you're a woman, transgender, or gender non-conforming, you really weren't living your best life, right? You didn't have the freedoms that men had back in the Victorian era, right? You were sort of living this suppressed lifestyle?
Yeah, I think what we see from looking at history is that these people who were kind of outside of the gender norms, the gender rebels, if you want, they did have loving families who supported them, and they were living, I don't know about best life, we weren't there, but they were here, but absolutely there were challenges that if you did not conform to what society expected, then you could face all kinds of repercussions. In the tour, we talk about people being arrested, different ways that their lives were impacted negatively because of the gender norms of that time period.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the tour? Like, how is the Dalnavert Museum going to be used to sort of get these ideas across?
Yeah, so the museum, if you haven't been before, is a historic house. So it's inside, it's set up like a house would have looked in 1895 in Winnipeg. So what we've done is we have taken the different rooms, so like the kitchen, the parlor, the bedroom, and as we go through the different rooms, we're linking ideas with those spaces. So in the kitchen, we talk about domestic work and the different spheres of, women's work versus men's work. In the study, we talk about Cora Hind because she was the secretary for Hugh John, and it was Hugh John's study. In the bedroom, we talk about sexuality, those kinds of things. So the house is kind of a backdrop, and the artifacts that we have really allow us to paint that picture, if you will, of what life would have been like in those days.
Mm-hmm. Are there any specific figures or movements that are going to be highlighted during the tour, like specifically?
I don't want to give too much away because I think the really fun thing about the tour is discovering new information about maybe some authors that you've heard about before or different figures in Canadian history that you're going to learn something new about. Obviously, we talk about the suffragist movement throughout the tour. We're talking about the everything from women wearing pants and riding bicycles all the way through to I think the term is female husbands. So there is this whole range of really interesting content that you can expect.
Yeah, we were talking about this off air, and I fell down very much a rabbit hole this morning about the suffragist movement. I learned about the blue stockings, this idea that if you're a woman and you were too well read, that was an issue, and simply owning property was not allowed back in the Victorian era as well, right?
Yeah, I think the coolest thing that I learned through this process, well, maybe not the coolest, but one of the things that I really took to heart is the fact that we use the term suffragist in Canada, whereas in England, you may have heard the term suffragette.
Yeah.
And that difference being that the suffragettes in England were considered by the Canadian suffragists to be way more radical. Yeah. They were much more willing, and I think in the States as well, they were suffragettes, and they were doing way more radical things in terms of like violence and protest, whereas the women here they kind of felt, we want to distinguish ourselves in a different way. And that's where the whole femininity and those kinds of things being used came out in our own brand of fighting for women's rights here in Manitoba.
Mm-hmm. How do you think this tour is going to contribute to ongoing conversations about gender equality today?
I think, like I said, a lot of people are going to be surprised about the things that they may learn about historical figures or the fact even that trans individuals existed in the Victorian period. I think a lot of the time people think of some of these things as, modern inventions, and they're not. Trans individuals have existed throughout all time. And so I think that what I hope we can have is good conversations about what living in a society where we can all exist together really can look like. And that's something that, as a museum, we teach the past, but we hope that you take away from that past something that you can then use in your modern life.
Yeah, it's one of the whole reasons that we have history and to study it. It's so wonderful. I'm going to wrap up the conversation by asking what you hope people are going to take away from the tour, Spinsters and Suffragists, that's happening all month.
Yeah, I really hope that you can have a conversation with someone on a topic that maybe you have never broached before. I do hope that it just sparks that interest to maybe delve into things that you haven't ever learned about or talked about before.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, this has been so great to have you here and to talk to you. The Pink Tea Party and the tour Spinsters and Suffragists at the Dalnavert Museum sounds like it's going to be fantastic and a great way to mark Women's History Month. Thanks so much for taking the time to stop by and talk to me today. It's been great.
Thank you.